Hi, I'm Mira from Arlington, Massachusetts, and you're listening to Alex Barrio, who is running for state legislature in Florida on Two Broads Talking Politics.
Hi everyone, this is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics, and I am joined today by Alex Barrio, who is running for the Florida House in District 43. Hi, Alex.
Hi, Kelly. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to speak with you today. Could you start by just giving us a little bit of background on who you are and why you're running for the Florida House?
My name is Alex Barrio. I'm the political director of Alianza for Progress. Alianza is a national nonprofit organization that works mostly in Florida, but also in D.C. and parts around the country to mobilize and engage Latino voters, particularly the Puerto Rican community, to build a strong progressive base of voters to essentially push progressive politics and progressive policies with our elected officials. Prior to that, I was the district director for Congressman Soto for 2 years. And as district director, I worked in this community in Central Florida to engage people with their representatives. I mean, civic engagement to me is one of the most important things. It's one of the most valuable things that we should be doing in Florida and across the country, getting people involved in the process and showing them their power. As district director, I worked closely with the community, helping Hurricane Maria evacuees. We had over 300,000 come to Florida immediately following the hurricane. I also worked with a group of students at UCF, specifically the Iranian Students Association, during the travel ban era when Muslims were flying in or attempting to come to Florida, students, family members, relatives, and I worked with those students and actually went with them to the airport multiple times to try to make sure that their family members and students themselves got in safely during the travel ban era at the beginning. That was January, February of 2017. So I've just been involved in the community for a very, very long time. My first true, the trigger for me to get involved in politics was the 2000 election. I was 15, and I remember staying up all night watching the turmoil on election night, 3, 4 in the morning. We didn't know who the president was. I was living in Florida in Jacksonville when I had just moved to Florida. I actually grew up in Newark, New Jersey, and then moved to Jacksonville when I was 15. And seeing that, and it really engaged me. Then the war in Iraq in 2003, again, became very, very impassioned about that and the Iraq war and anti-Bush, which led me to my first campaign job, which was working as a canvasser for John Kerry in 2004. Then I worked on some state legislative races. I went to law school in Miami. After I graduated law school from 2013 to 2015, I worked as a legislative analyst in the Senate here in Tallahassee, the Florida State Senate, with the Democratic Caucus. Worked on legislation related to election reform, immigration, children, family, and elder affairs, just a whole host of issues. And now I'm here. I'm in Orlando, or in Kissimmee, rather, which is south of Orlando, and I'm running to represent District 43, which is the largest district by population in Florida. It's had the most growth since the census. It is also the district where we have one of the highest poverty rates in Florida and across the country, and also the lowest median wages in all of the United States. This is where the tourism employees live. We're south of Disney. You have a lot of Disney employees, Universal Studios, the hotels, the resorts, the restaurants, and wages have just been flat for decades, while the cost of housing have risen dramatically, and the costs of pretty much everything, healthcare, transportation. And so this is a community that drastically needs help. They actually made a movie about my district, about my district. It's called The Florida Project. It's from 2017, and it's about homeless people that live in motels outside of Disney. And that's my district. That's District 43. And it's estimated there's about 6,000 people, including over 1,000 children, that are homeless, living in motels. here in Central Florida in District 43, and I'm running to be their advocate. They are my neighbors. I live in a neighborhood right behind a couple of these motels and this shopping center called Plaza del Sol. And so I'm running to advocate for them and everybody in District 43.
So you have a lot of political experience, a lot of experience helping other campaigns, helping other people. How is it different sort of running for your own campaign? How is knocking on doors and running for office different when you are the candidate?
It's just different in a whole host of ways. So number one, the most crucial way is fundraising, right? When you're the candidate, fundraising falls entirely on your back. You are the one that has to make those phone calls, has to schedule those meetings. And it is very, very difficult and draining at times. You know, I'm not someone that comes from wealth. I don't have a lot of wealthy friends. I'm lucky that I've been able to raise, small dollar contributions from over 200 people in the first, 10 weeks of my campaign. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of pressure for me to try to get to the money that I need. This is a state house race where my budget's, going to be $100,000. Relatively low budget compared to congressional races or even other state legislative races in the state, like in Metro Orlando or in South Florida or Miami. But still $100,000, when your average contribution is, $75, that's how many people? 1,200, 1,300. So all of that work falls on you versus when you're a candidate, when you're working for a campaign, you don't really have to worry about that so much or see it unless you're a finance director. But even then, finance directors are just helping the candidate. So fundraising, the pressure from fundraising is dramatic. It can be very intense and stressful because you want to have the resources to compete, to hire good staff, to pay your people well. There's this great idea and hope that you'll get all these volunteers to come out and work for you, but they're not just going to show up and they're not going to be there consistently if you don't have snacks, T-shirts, literature, all these things that you need resources to earn. So fundraising is, a huge shift. It's a big difference versus working on a campaign. In terms of the field and at the doors, the response is definitely different when you're saying, I'm Alex Barrio and I'm a volunteer or a, canvasser for such and such candidate versus I'm Alex Barrio, I'm the candidate. People get a little bit more excited and they ask you questions. They ask you really, really tough questions sometimes. They ask you what you want to do. I'm a firm believer in field and that direct voter contact in terms of knocking on doors, going to events, phoning occasionally, but mostly knocking on doors and having face-to-face conversations is the most effective way to get elected. It is time-consuming, but it is so valuable. And when you are the candidate there, you really see that as people get so excited and enthusiastic and really ask you hard questions and press and share their stories. People love to share their personal stories and their personal narratives, and I love to hear them. I love to know what people are going through and struggling with because I want to help people. It's what I've been doing since I graduated college, working with the community, or even while I was in college, doing constituent services, working on policy issues to help people and to try to bring things, just try to make things better for people. But you can't do that if you don't know what people are struggling with, and the best way to hear that is at the doors. And I get that a lot, more so than working on behalf of a candidate. When you have that connection and you build that personal connection, the constituents feel that and they know it and they see it, and they're just so much more open. It's a really good feeling.
So I want to talk some about what you think that you and Democrats in general can accomplish in the state legislature. So people think of Florida as a swing state, and it is on statewide elections, but the state house is overwhelmingly Republican. It's a pretty big split. What do you think? Do you think there are opportunities for bipartisan legislation? What do you think you and the other Democrats will be able to do if you're elected?
I think there's absolutely an opportunity. The opportunity, of course, requires leadership and time and investment. The legislature is Republican. In the state house, it's 73 Republicans to 47 Democrats. So on the margins in committees and working certain issues, there is a lot of opportunity. For example, affordable housing. Florida has what is known as the Sadowski Affordable Housing Trust Fund. It's hundreds of millions of dollars through a documentary stamp tax on home sales. Every year, the legislature rates most or all of it to other programs. But there are a lot of Republicans who see the crisis in affordable housing in Florida and who want to stop that. The Senate Majority Leader, Kathleen Passidomo, she has been one of the biggest advocates for preserving the Affordable Housing Trust Fund and not rating it. There's a Republican representative in Central Florida named Renee Placencia who's been an advocate for it. And so the Republicans are there. There are certain people, and it's just expanding that coalition, making sure all the Democrats are on board with it, with getting these Affordable Housing Trust Fund monies to the areas that need them the most, and particularly my area, of course, in Osceola County, but also working with them to help their areas and their communities and their constituents. Housing is a crisis, one of our many crises, and how do we manage that? And so there's an opportunity there. On healthcare, everybody knows that healthcare costs are rising. Medicine, every day you hear a new story and people are keeping it in the press about the high cost of insulin, people rationing insulin and dying. This is affecting everybody. There's no, diabetics are not one party or another. It's across the board. And so how can we work to reduce the cost of medicine and actually in a more comprehensive way? This year, the legislature passed a bill that would allow Florida to import Canadian drugs, prescription medications. However, that's not enough. And ultimately, what we're doing is we're paying Canada to enforce price controls on drugs that are manufactured here and then re-importing them. We can do what Canada does to control drug prices and keep drug prices low, even lower than what we would get from re-importation. Passing Medicaid is one thing. Florida, and a few years ago when I was up there in 2015, the Senate actually passed Medicaid expansion 39-1. And the House refused to pass it and ended up leading to a special session where they were, essentially it didn't happen because the House just refused to budge. But there is an appetite for that, though, of course, that depends on whether or not, a Democrat wins in 2020. If I win, I would come in 2021. And if you have a Democrat in office, they're probably going to do something about health care that is drastically different, an improvement of what we're doing now, maybe a public option, maybe Medicare for all, though that politically is a lot more difficult to do. But if Trump wins re-election, then we have to renew the fight for Medicaid expansion. Over 1 million working people in Florida, people with jobs, do not have health insurance because they cannot afford monthly premiums. Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act was made to directly address this by subsidizing premiums for our poorest people, the working poor, the people that are working at restaurants and theme parks in my district and living in motels. They need this. And so this is a fight where there are Republicans who have already supported it, and it's just bringing them back into the fold and putting pressure on them to put pressure on the rest of their colleagues to get this done, because it's not going to go away unless we do something about it. You can't just ignore the uninsured in the hopes that their status will magically change. It's not the situation. Unless we expand Medicaid, unless we dramatically increase the minimum wage, something's got to give to help these people in their pocketbook. And this is one thing that we can do and we know we can do. And we know that's worked. That works in other states. That's worked in Kentucky and Ohio and Louisiana, conservative states with conservative legislatures and sometimes Republican governors who've passed this legislation. So let's just stop the politics, stop the nonsense, and just get it done. And I hope there is an appetite for that. In Florida, we have very vigorous term limits, 8 years in the House, 8 years in the Senate. So the turnover is dramatic. Next year, a full quarter of the legislature is going to be brand new. And then we have the census and redistricting. And so then another third of the legislature will be brand new after 2022. If I win and win re-election, that'll be my second term. We'll have more than half of the legislature will have turned over. So there's a real opportunity to build relationships with Republicans right when they come in, early on, and move forward over the next few years before, term limits takes all of us out. So, that's my hope and my vision. And I think those are the issues where we can really build bridges.
You mentioned earlier about the influx of Puerto Ricans into Florida after Hurricane Maria. Can you talk some about the way that adding that many people to Florida, sort of all at once, the way that's changed sort of the landscape of Florida, and in what particular challenges that population has, in terms of all the things that they might need to be able to sort of get their feet after, going through this horrific hurricane?
Absolutely. So the first thing that we have to understand about this is that there was already a huge Puerto Rican population in Florida beforehand, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans from the island and also from New York and Chicago who had already been settled here. After Hurricane Maria, over 300,000 people flew through the Orlando International Airport from the island. We know that most of them did not stay in Central Florida, but the estimate is between 70 and 100,000 did end up staying. So the dramatic shift, however, in 2018, most of those people were not engaged politically. They were still trying to settle, right? Trying to get their kids enrolled in school, find new jobs, get their licenses in order. You had a lot of professionals, lawyers, nurses, doctors, et cetera, who had to transfer their licenses and change and adjust and make that adjustment. So culturally, there wasn't that much of a shift because we have so many Puerto Ricans and they are already involved pretty robustly in society. We have a lot of Puerto Rican local and state elected officials. We have a Puerto Rican congressman, Darren Soto. So they're already involved. And then politically, the impact hadn't been seen yet because most of them didn't vote. In 2020, however, that is going to change. Now they've resettled. One of the most interesting things, and ultimately it's totally unpredictable. We don't know what their turnout's going to be, and we don't know how they're going to vote, but we do know that they are becoming very, very engaged because of what happened with Trump and the lack of disaster relief being delivered to the island and the corruption on the island that led to 2 weeks of protest that overthrew their governor. This is a community that has felt disenfranchised for decades, if not longer, and now feels emboldened, and they see their power. If they see what happened in Puerto Rico and ultimately harness that power towards voting, and particularly voting against Trump, voting for someone new, then there will be a dramatic shift, and we'll see it obviously at the highest of the national level. There's over 1 million Puerto Ricans in Florida. If they all came out and voted, and they all voted one way as a block, which it's not going to happen because there are a lot of conservative Puerto Ricans, then, you will see a dramatic shift. Ultimately, it's unpredictable. We saw from 2014 to 2018 a big increase in the Puerto Rican vote for a midterm election, but it wasn't at the presidential level. But if we have such a dramatic increase going into 2020 relative to 2016, then it will be impacted. I mean, Donald Trump won by a little over 100,000 votes in Florida. There are way more than 100,000 Puerto Ricans who have never voted in Florida before that are eligible and that can vote. And if they do vote, they will make the difference if they vote in that direction. It's unpredictable, but it's exciting because it is an emboldened community that has seen the power that is in their hands to change the direction of their politics with what happened with Rosselló. And so my hope is that they'll continue to keep that energy and maintain it going forward. But a lot of it rests on, who the Democratic candidate for president is and what the Democratic nominees do over the next year and what Trump does over the next year. There's always a possibility that, however slight, that all of a sudden he pivots, becomes really engaged, invests dramatically in Puerto Rico, moves to the middle on, gun violence, education, healthcare, and all of a sudden it's like he has a great shot. Is it going to happen? I'm very, very skeptical, but the opportunity is there. Puerto Ricans are not loyal to one party or another. They truly, truly are people, swing voters, that look at the candidate and try to vote for what they believe is in their best interest. True swing voters. And so this huge block of swing voters that may or may not turn out, that are emboldened, I mean, the possibilities are endless.
Yeah. You mentioned when you were in the working in the state Senate earlier that you were working on voter suppression and laws about expanded voter access. I think that a lot of us look at Florida and we're very concerned about whether there is sufficient voter access, whether there is any fraud or just incompetence perhaps going on in elections and voting. Can you talk some about, whether you have any of those same fears, but also the kinds of things you would like to see passed to ensure strong voter access?
First of all, I absolutely share those fears. As someone who witnessed, not so much firsthand, I was in high school, but who's witnessed, the 2000 recount, but then subsequent issues since then and subsequent recounts. Last year in 2018, we had multiple recounts in the state legislature, governor, the U.S. Senate race, of course, and Nikki Fried for agricultural commissioner. Locally, we had a recount on the county commission race. This county commission candidate won by 100 votes out of over 70,000 cast. So there is that concern and that fear of voter suppression. I share it and I know it. Florida is a 50-50 state. And in a state this close, the margins matter. And, if certain supervisors of elections, and they have a lot of freedom in creating precincts and polling locations, if they have, one polling location or all the Republican polling locations only have 50 or 75 or a couple hundred voters and there's no lines, and then you have more Democratic leaning communities where there's one polling location for 5,000 voters, which is something I've seen and witnessed personally in Kissimmee and Buenaventura Lakes in 2012. The largest precinct in Florida is in Buenaventura Lakes. They have, I believe, 6,000 registered voters. And they say, well, we have the community center. We have hundreds of voting machines. And it's like, well, I remember in 2012, being out at the polling lines till 9 o'clock at night, making sure that people got to vote when I was field director for a state Senate campaign. And so there is that concern, and there are ways in which local supervisors of elections can and do manipulate things. We have at the highest level, the governors and the state legislature, the Republicans there, they have absolutely zero interest in doing anything to further secure our ballots, right? We know that Russia hacked the Florida elections. Senator Rick Scott made fun of Bill Nelson for pointing it out. And then after he got elected, he had a briefing and he was like, oh, it actually did happen, right? Governor DeSantis has been briefed on it. They have done literally nothing at the federal level. Mitch McConnell blocked legislation to secure our voting machines. They see that it is helping them win, and so they are not doing anything about it. It's a very cynical, anti-democracy, disgraceful, I think, attitude. It's something definitely I want to fight against if elected. But yeah, these fears are there. What I would like to see is standards for ballots, for instance. Every county has its own ballot design. And we know in Broward County, there was a huge, huge undervote in the U.S. Senate race because the Senate race between Nelson and Scott was under the instructions. And so a lot of people missed it. And we're talking about, over 30,000 undervotes versus other counties where you would have maybe a few hundred undervotes because ballot design was different. So I would love to see ballot design standards. Obviously in 2000, we had the butterfly ballots and the hanging chads. The fact that we still have ballot design issues 18 years after that because there are no state standards is, it's insane. It's absolutely absurd. But Republicans have controlled the governorship in both houses of the legislature since then. They see the advantage in having confusing ballots and no standards. And so they're being benefited by it. So they're going to keep the status quo. That's one thing I'd like to see. I'd like to see standards in terms of precincts, making sure that people are not forced to stand in line for hours because their precinct has thousands of people, and then a neighboring precinct in a gated community has only 200 voters, and there's no line, no waiting. That's inefficient, first of all, but also it's unfair. So I'd love to see those precinct standards and, expanding early vote. One of the things that I worked on in 2013 was Bill SB 600, which extended eligibility of certain locations that could be early voting sites. It gave supervisor of elections the option of putting early voting sites on college campuses. Some have taken advantage of it, some have not. but I would like to make that more explicit and require, especially in general elections, that an early voting site be on college campuses so that students can register there. I'd love to see same-day registration, if not automatic ideally automatic voter registration, where you simply, voter registration is tied to the Department of Highway Safety and Motor Vehicles records, like they do, I believe, in Oregon, and I think in Colorado as well. So you don't have to go through a whole registration process. We know you're a valid voter in Florida because you have an ID or a driver's license from the state with an address in Florida. That would be a very easy, simple way to do it instead of having our double system where voter registration purges happen, right? So the legislature, the Secretary of State, if somebody hasn't voted in 2 or 3 elections in a row, they just purge hundreds of thousands of voters. So inconsistent voters have to re-register. They might have problems, and they don't even know. They don't even know that they got purged, because they moved. They didn't vote for a couple cycles, and all of a sudden they're purged and they want to come back, and then they get denied at the polling place. So fixing those things would definitely be a priority to me. And, there might be an appetite for it after the 2020 election if it's another debacle with multiple recounts and issues. But if the 2020 election runs smoothly, we've seen politically there's a lot, the status quo reigns. And so we'll see. I hope that we have a fair, open election and, the best candidate who gets the most votes wins. And there aren't any shenanigans, but, there's no guarantee of that. So we'll see. And if it doesn't happen, then I'm definitely going to be fighting for these reforms and potentially others.
Is there anything else that you would like to make sure that we talk about today?
Gun violence. One of the things, Central Florida is home of Pulse. South Florida is home of Parkland. These are tragically iconic locations where extreme tragedies, shootings happened. And, if elected, I would definitely like to do more. You have children and parents that are terrified. They are absolutely terrified, especially after El Paso, Dayton this weekend. They're not secure and they're not safe. And the lack of safety is frustrating and frightening. One of the things we need to do in Florida is close the gun show loophole, make sure we have background checks. Today, President Trump and Mitch McConnell vaguely said that they were probably open to it, but we need real action. Next year, there's going to be potentially a ban on assault weapons on the ballot to ban the sale of assault weapons in Florida. That's a good first step, but it's not enough if they're not banned in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, or Georgia. These are states that have driven through and to, in an afternoon. So we need national action to address gun violence, keep the weapons of war out of people's hands. And the state should be fighting for it and will be fighting for it. And I would fight for it as a state legislator, but I would love to see some national action just so that we don't have to continue adding cities to this list of tragedies that keep happening. We're getting to a point now where, everybody not just knows one person that's been affected by our gun violence epidemic, but multiple people I've met. And I know the Parkland kids. I know people who were at Pulse. I had been to Pulse before when I was younger, and I lived right behind it in a townhouse for a year with a friend of mine. Everybody has these stories and these experiences and the pain. And we have to do more to just end this. And we have to, frankly, elect people who care and who feel about it and who aren't beholden to the NRA or to, status quo institutions that are just unwilling to do anything. And one thing about that too, there's this constant attack saying, well, this is a mental health crisis. This is a mental health crisis. It's not a mental health crisis. Most people who suffer with mental health issues are not violent. Okay. And there are a lot of women in this country who have mental health issues, then they are not committing these acts. We're looking at young men, predominantly white, committing these acts. And we have to have a real honest discussion about that and about when we talk about this being a mental health crisis, who is it a crisis of? And so addressing the fact that we're dealing with white males who are becoming radicalized online not just by white nationalists, but also by a dangerous, violent, misogynistic ideology through the incel, involuntary celibate movement, men's rights activists. Like, these are the real crises that we're dealing with, and we have to have an honest and open discussion about addressing this and addressing the crisis of masculinity and misogyny and how it's leading to violence in our country. Because I think that's truly the root of it. Say, oh, it's mental illness, like, it's not. People are managing mental illnesses all the time. This is about something else, something more, and we need to address and fight to solve it in a real practical matter.
All right. If people would like to help out your campaign, how can they do that?
First of all, please visit my website, alexbarrio.com, AlexBarrio.com. And if you live in Central Florida and would like to volunteer, please sign up to volunteer today. If not, but you'd still like to help out, any and all contributions are welcome. You know, from $1 to the individual limit is $1,000. I'm building a grassroots campaign. I've gotten over 200 individual donors. Step 4, my average is $75. And I'm trying to build a movement here to get regular people like myself who've been involved in the process because they care, to get into those rooms. Because what I've found through my career is ultimately, if you want to make change, you have to be at the table where those decisions are made, and you can lobby and advocate all the time. But to truly make a difference, running for office, stepping up and joining the fight is the best and most effective way to be there. And so if any of your listeners would love to help me out, please visit my website and donate today.
All right. Excellent. We'll put a link up on our website so people can find that.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, Alex, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today. And thank you for running. I think you have a lot of really great ideas and passion, clearly, for what you're doing. So I'm really excited about your campaign.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks for giving me this opportunity. And, if anything comes up in the future, and if you're ever in Florida, need restaurant recommendations or anything, feel free to reach out.
Thanks for listening to Two Broads Talking Politics. Our theme song is called Are You Listening? Off of the album Elephant Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast.